I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening to the first evening of Economy of Crisis Capitalism, Ecology of the Commons event. First, two thank yous. First goes to Goethe Institut, Kroatian, who are our hosts in this nice Rhine Capitalism building. And the second goes to my partners in crime in organizing this event. So it's Center for Labor Studies, Centar za radničke studije, Pravo na grad, Right to the City, Zagreb, and Heinrich Böll Stiftung, Hrvatska Asia. I'm coming from the organization called Multimedia Institute. We do most technology, activism, culture, and some issues related to spatial justice. And should you have any questions, please approach me. There are two good announcements that I have to make. First, there is the new issue of Zagreb, and it deals in part with commons. And there is, freshly from print, the new issue of Libra Libera. The copies are available there, outside in the lobby. You can take them, and it's a special issue on the commons. So it's quite convenient, huh? So, a couple of words of introduction about the event. There has been a fundamental resetting in socioeconomic relations in the First and Second World over the last couple of decades. Growing financialization, planetary expansion of capitalism, and global integration of goods, services, and labor markets that now include and pit against each other in direct competition the advanced capitalist economies, the emerging economies, and the fully transitioned and privatized economies of the former socialist states, such as ours. All these processes have led to ever greater concentration of social wealth in the hands of the few, to carving out of social rights for the most, and to overuse of resources of sea and land, pushing our planet to the verge of environmental collapse. The recent crisis has been a final turn of the screw in that process, insofar as it has laid bare the structural weakness of that zenith of historical progress known as global capitalism. The debt-fueled financial markets have collapsed over a speculative bubble in the real estate markets, forcing states to bail them out with public money. The decades of economicization of society through programs and silent measures of privatization, creeping marketization, and private-public partnerships have now been resumed by austerity politics and structural adjustment programs that are deepening the economic barriers to some of the essential resources needed to sustain our livelihoods. The crisis being also a prolonged crisis of profits, the capital just cannot pass up on the opportunities to expand its accumulation to those previously non-monetized goods and services that nobody can afford not to pay, such as healthcare, water, sanitation, electricity. Given that the material basis of social equality is being undercut, it is no surprise that it's the commons at whose center lies the concern for collective access to resources, so that the commons have recently become the mobilizing credo of social struggles. Struggles against privatizations of public goods, against marketization of education and healthcare, against cuts in public services, against resocialization of private risks, against debt, against land grab and privatization of public space, against patents over biological foundations of life, against economic barriers to vital drugs, against enclosures of knowledge and culture, and so on and so on. At the core of this resurgence of commons as a mobilizing agenda lies a counter-project to the economicization of society. And that counter-project is the one of resocialization of economy, one that begs the question how to act. That is, how to act politically in order to bring the economic development in line with the social justice. It also reflects a unique historic balance of powers, where the dichotomy of state versus market has proven inapt to help us out of this situation. It is the state that is now helping the private capture the public. Approaching the central task of resocialization of economy through commons perspective, approaching that central task of resocialization of economy through commons perspective opens up to a number of considerations. First, access to social rights on the base of needs and not dispensable income. Think of healthcare. Second, economic democracy by means of collective management of resources and their production. And then there are third and fourth, such as reclamation of privatized and abused resources through processes such as remunicipalization or resocialization, or self-organization of production and reproduction, or sustainability of resources, limits to growth, and planetary dimension of local socioeconomic activity. For this political project of resocialization of economy to work, this perspective can obviously not be taken as exhaustive, as enough. These are just some pieces of that puzzle. While many struggles nowadays are happening around the collectivization of consumption, access to resources, and their democratic control, the perspective of the relations of production remains central to another set of struggles today. The prevailing dogma is that there is no escaping the systemic conditions that are dictated by the global capitalism. The national economies have to be streamlined to prevent the bleeding of capital. The critical accounts and sober analysis on the left show too that the laws of motion of capital in fact don't leave much space for action and reform unless we fundamentally change the capitalist mode of production. On the other hand, when pressed for alternatives, we become frustrated over how political transformations that we envision seem ungraspable, unreachable from where we stand. But this seeming impasse, a gap between the concrete analysis and the utopian political imaginary, that is a fallacy. It is the system that is proving to be systematically and humanely unsustainable. It is an impasse in itself. So starting from wherever our cool-headed analysis shows is the best to start is already good enough. It's best enough. We start with what we have, municipalizations of public services, with collective budgeting, with regaining rights in the place of work, taking the democratic control over the financial sector. And we move into a place where this fallacy breaks and social conflict starts to become concrete. So, for this conference, if I may voice an expectation as an organizer, the goal should be to focus on strategies. We wish to discuss avenues of possible political action and new political categories that would allow labor organizations, social movements, and political actors to stop the paralysis imposed by the current dominant interpretation of the crisis as that of public profligacy and unsustainability of welfare state. But a particular emphasis we want to place on how existing social movements in the form of activist or civil groups can continue their action beyond their immediate occasion, location, and time of emergence. And secondly, how can we advocate and implement processes of resocialization or remunicipalization of resources and building in the democratic controls in those resources? Our first speaker tonight in the conference is focusing precisely on articulating the strategies in the specific current nexus between the declining social rights and the declining welfare state on the one hand, and the strategies of labor organizations in the ongoing resetting of relations between labor and capital. Asbjørn Wahl is advisor at the Norwegian Union of Municipal and General Employees and director of the Board of Campaign for the Welfare State in Norway. He serves as the Vice President of the Road Transport Workers section of the International Transport Workers Federation and as the chair of ITF Working Group on Climate Change. He is also a member of the coordinating committee of Forum Social Europe, which is an informal network for progressive trade unions in Europe, and he's active in the Labor and Globalization Network. Trained in history and sociology, he has published a number of articles on politics, social, and labor questions in magazines and books both in Norway, and I may mention here also in Croatia. You can find translated articles on Slobodni Filozofski and on the page of the conference. His most recent publication is The Rise and Fall of Welfare States, and tonight he's going to talk about some of the central concerns of his study and the way he sees strategies for labor movement today. I think that the book is available there, but Asbjørn, you might say more about that.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me here to talk about this issue, the rise and fall of the welfare state. I'm going to talk about strategies and struggles, but in order to get the strategies right, I think you have to have the analysis right. So I will use quite a lot of the time here to analyze the development of the welfare state. Because if we understand the development of the welfare state, it is easier also to develop other policies and also to understand what is going on around us today. As Tomislav said, I've written this book with the same title as my lecture here tonight, and there are some copies over there for sale. I'm sorry for that, I have to say that. But if you want them, they are at the discount price they are. I'm from Norway, and the Nordic countries are often seen as the most advanced welfare state in the world. For a long period, it was Sweden that was used as an example, because the welfare state was developed to a highest level, I think, in Sweden 10, 20 years ago. That is no longer the case. Also the Nordic model, the Nordic countries are changing. And actually, in the current situation, Norway is on top, I think, of the welfare state model. And the main reason for that is the enormous oil revenue that we get from the North Sea, which in a way damped the pressure on the public sector in Norway. Norwegian politicians, of course, they try to explain to us that the reason for that is that the Norwegian policies and Norwegian government is much better than the rest of the world in governing and in managing the economy, and that's the reason for it. But I think, to be honest, it is mainly the oil revenue that protect Norway today. So Norway is an exception in the situation in Europe today. But my view and my analysis tells me that what is happening in Europe will happen in Norway. So if the welfare states fall in Europe, it will fall in Norway. So, and if the trade union movement is defeated in Europe, it will be defeated in Norway. So that's the reality I think we face. And both of those statements are sort of realistic, defensive, maybe a little bit pessimistic, but it does not have to happen. But that is the course we are on in the current situation in Europe, in the aftermath of the financial an economic crisis. Well, let me start then by stating the following about the welfare state. The welfare state represented great progress in terms of living and working conditions, unprecedented in the history of mankind. Public health, life expectancy, and social security improved enormously as the welfare state developed in the last century. And the main part of that happened after the Second World War. So it was a pretty short historic period in which this welfare state has been dominating in the Nordic states, but also in general in Western Europe. Does it disappear? Can you hear me? Good? Okay, that's fine. So this is the start of it. But that means also that the population in all these countries, or in Western Europe, in the Nordic countries, have always been overwhelmingly in favor of the welfare state. In spite of that, we have seen over the last 10, 20, 30 years that the welfare state has been undermined, and that is maybe, like the title of my lecture, maybe we are facing its fall. But that will depend on what happens with the struggle, of course. In my analysis, the welfare and the state and welfare in general is a question of social power. I will focus a lot of that in my lecture tonight, because from time to time I think that is sort of overseen in the analysis, at least in the mainstream discussion about the welfare state. But to me, it is all a question of power. So in the last resort, welfare is a question of the distribution of wealth in society. That's exactly what the welfare state did. Or to say it in another way, what the welfare state did was to distribute the wealth in society in another way that the market did. That was the whole point in a way. If the market had done it, it wouldn't have been necessary to intervene into the market to establish these welfare services. So it is, from the very beginning, it is directed towards the market forces in order to compensate for the deficiencies of the market and to reduce the effect of the markets on people. But the distribution of wealth in society is exactly a question of economic and social power, because it is those groups in society which have most economic and social power which are able also to influence the distribution of wealth in society. But what is it then that gives us economic and social power? Well, economic power, we know what it is. What is social power? How do we get social power? Well, in the trade union and labor movement, at least, we have learned that to have strong organization, to have a high level of unionization, to be willing to fight, to take action when necessary and so on, that contributes to give you power in society. But also we have seen that it's very difficult to keep a mobilization of people, a mobilization of workers over a very long time. It goes up and down, it's ebb and tide in this sort of mobilization. So in order to stabilize and to establish a lasting fundament for social power, we also have to include that control and ownership of capital, of resources in society, for a most important basis for social power. That's the reason why it was so important in Norway 100 years ago to get national and democratic control of the hydroelectric energy, for example, which started off from the very beginning being private investments. It was British, German and French capital which came to Norway and started to develop the hydroelectric energy. And it was a long political struggle in Norway until we, about 1920, got full democratic national control over that resource. And that was important because that was used to industrialize Norway. So it influenced very much the development of society, and control of resources and capital is decisive in social power. But the power relations in society is not only reflecting the situation within the borders of a state, of a nation. It is also influenced by more general global power relations. And I would say that the welfare state had these three foundation pillars when it's come to this more global or wider context. The first foundation pillar is what is called the social help state, the development of the first tendencies to develop public welfare services. And that did not take place in the Nordic countries. It took place in Germany under Bismarck. So the reactionary Bismarck was the first one to start to implement public services, public welfare services, unemployment benefit, and so on. And why did the reactionary Bismarck do that? Yeah, the historians say there are two reasons for that. The first reason why the Bismarck did it was that this was in the period of the 1870s, 1880s and so on, in the period when they had very rapid industrialization, new mines, new factories were built with enormously harsh working conditions. And workers were expelled from the labor market rapidly because the health broke down. So the people, the elite, the capitalists and the employers were actually concerned that they would not have enough labor force in the future if they continued like that to break down the health of people after pretty short time in the mines and in the factories. So the first reason for Bismarck to introduce this protection of workers and social benefits and like that was actually to secure the reproduction of labor. The second reason is maybe even more interesting in this connection, because what happened at the same time in Germany was that this new working class, growing working class, started to organize and to radicalize. And they started to organize and form socialist parties and so on. And that was seen as a threat to the existing elite, to the employers, to the capital owners. So the second reason why Bismarck introduced public welfare services was to damp the radicalism of this new working class. And I think that is very well proved, that it was not to be kind to the workers that he did it, because at the same time as he introduced these public welfare services, he banned the Social Democratic Party. So, once again, and that is interesting now, that and it has been the situation all the time in the history of the welfare state, that the welfare state is a result of a compromise. We will come back to that. The second pillar is, of course, what took the welfare state from the very minimum level of Bismarck up to the level that we see in the Nordic countries, have seen over the last 30 years, namely the struggle of organized labor. That was what really took the society forward. And the third pillar is linked to this second one, of course, but I think it's important to bring it up as an independent one, because this is linked to this system competition between the East and West, between Western capitalism and the Soviet model. And it is mainly Eric Hobsbawm, the British historian, that developed this theory at the beginning of the 1990s, when he published his book about the 20th century. And his theory was, in short, the following. Why, asked Eric Hobsbawm, why did the employers, why did the capitalists in Western Europe accept that such a big part of value added was used in order to build social welfare for the population? Because that was nothing that the employers and capitalist owners used to do. So why were they willing to do that in the post-war period? And his answer is, it was because of the threat of the East, of the alternative model. We have to go back to 1945 and think what was the situation at that time. It was a radicalized working class that came out of the war. It was an attempt at revolution, socialist revolution in Greece, which was defeated by French and British forces. It was on the verge of social upheaval in Italy and France, with very, very strong communist parties and communist trade unions and so on. So, in order, once again, same as Bismarck, in order to dampen radicalism of the working class in Western Europe, the employers and capital owners gave in to a lot of the demands of the working class in order to reduce the threat against the system. And also the governments and in general the Western world was dependent of support from their own population in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. So they were willing to give in to a lot of the demands of ordinary people and the working class in Western world in order to secure the support in the Cold War. So this was the three pillars that form the sort of power context in which the welfare state developed. So based on that, we developed then the welfare economy, based on a considerable shift in the balance of power, because that was exactly what happened, what took place. And it had to happen in order to develop the welfare state. And it was institutionalized, some of it was institutionalized under this post-war politics of the Bretton Woods. The Bretton Woods meeting, Bretton Woods is a city in the US, you know, in which the leaders of the victorious states at the end of the Second World War, 1944, met in order to agree on in which way they should organize the post-war economy. And remember, they had the disastrous and deep crisis of the 1930s behind them, before the war. So nobody at this conference proposed to have free movement of capital and deregulation and everything. That was exactly what they had in the 1930s, which has led to the crisis. So what was proposed in Bretton Woods in 1994 was to regulate the economy, control financial capital, introduce capital control, and so on. And Keynes, the famous economist, was at this meeting. He didn't succeed in getting through all his proposals, but he influenced quite a lot of what happened in Bretton Woods. And that resulted in that the countries introduced capital control and market interventions. And the market competition was dampened through these policies. And that means also that the pressure on workers was reduced, because if the competition in the labor market is reduced, that means also to reduce the pressure on workers. So there was a positive development of working conditions and so on. But the welfare state like this was still a result of this class compromise. It was not the solution of all social problems for the workers and for trade unions and for labor. It was a mix of things in which many of the measures that was introduced contributed to compensate the deficiencies of the market rather than to get rid of the problems. Just an example. Unemployment didn't disappear in this society, but you got unemployment benefit if you lost your job. So that is a sort of, you didn't solve the problem of unemployment, but you reduced the effects by introducing unemployment benefit. And in this way they built this welfare state with comprehensive social insurance schemes, public services, utilities, universal services, access for everybody to these services. And once again, I will remind you, it was a result of social struggle. It couldn't have happened without social struggle. well-developed welfare states were the results of social struggles based on popular mobilization and confrontation with the counterforces. I don't know if you have heard some social democrats and the mainstream sort of views on the welfare state from the Nordic countries, because they have mixed it completely up, according to my analysis. Because what the social democrats tell the members and people in the Nordic countries is about the following. We had hard confrontations and strikes and struggles from the end of the 19th century up to the 1930s. But then we decided to go into a compromise with capital employers. And that led us into a much more peaceful situation, a social peaceful situation. And then we were able to develop the welfare state and so on. So they see the welfare state as an effect of the change in policy from confrontation to consensus. And I think that is a complete mix-up of causes and effects. My view is that both the welfare state and the compromise and the consensus policy, they were both effects of the shift in the balance of power which had happened in the period before. So it was a shift, it was a struggle and a hard confrontation between labour and capital in the previous period that shifted the balance of power sufficiently to open the possibility for a welfare state development. And I think that is proved very well today if we see what is happening in Europe today. I'll come back to that. The next thing is that what helped, in addition to that, in order to stabilize a shift in this power relation, is also that a great part and an increasing part of the economy was taken out of the market and made subject to democratic governance. That is exactly the definition of the public economy. And the public economy in the Nordic countries, I think Sweden was the country in the Western world that had the highest part of its economy in public sector. They actually was over 70% in a short period. But in all the Nordic countries, we had more than 50% of the economy was in the public sector. That means a little less than 50% in the private sector. So the political economy, or the welfare state, was an economy in which half of the economy was a democratically governed planned economy, and the other half was a strict regulated market economy. So that is a political economy of the welfare state. So as you understand, it had to be quite strong, comprehensive changes, shifts in the balance of power in order to achieve that. And if you think that the Nordic countries always have been socially peaceful, that's not the case. Towards the end of the 19th century and beginning of 20th century, there were a lot of very, very hard confrontation between labour and capital. There were general strike after general strike, there were lockouts, there were use of police and military against striking workers. In all the Nordic countries, some of the workers on strike or in struggle was killed during some of these confrontations, also in the Nordic countries. So it did not happen peacefully. They had to go through a very, very long period of hard confrontation in order to be able to shift the power relations sufficiently. Some few extra words about this class compromise, because it is impossible to understand the welfare state without understanding the class compromise. The class compromise and the welfare state, they are in a way, sisters and brothers and whatever you want to explain. And this class compromise was, of course, between labour and capital. And it was the effect of a shift in power relations. You don't go into a compromise with somebody you can defeat, do you? If you can defeat your adversary, you do that. But if you can't defeat your adversary, you can choose to go into a compromise. And that was exactly the situation when the capital owners and employers in the 1930s and in the post-Second World War period started to go into compromises with labor in the countries, that was because they were not able to defeat them. And they realized they couldn't. So it was benefit to them to rather compromise than to try to defeat them. And then we had the post-war, post-Second World War period, a long period of a booming capitalism. So much production equipment was destroyed in the Second World War, so it was enormous production that had to happen in order to rebuild our societies, and that created the material precondition then for a long period of booming capitalism. And during this booming capitalism with high economic growth, the welfare state made it possible for ordinary people to improve their lives enormously. And that was the positive side of that development. But if we can talk about the negative effect of this development, was that the working class, the labor movement and the trade unions became depoliticized and de-radicalized during this period. And this is actually because they more or less thought they had won a lasting victory. They thought they got into a new, never more the mass unemployment of the 1930s. Never more the crisis. We have now come in a situation in which we have democratic control of the economy, and we are going to reform ourselves now into the beloved land, which still was socialism. Because in the party programs of the Social Democrats and the Socialists and the Communists and most of the trade union movements, they had socialism as their aim. Even in the 50s and 60s, it was first in the 70s, 80s that started to change that. So it was socialism, and they thought they were on the road to socialism. Only peaceful, step-by-step reforms would take them there. And they thought that the capitalism, the crisis-free capitalism was a reality. And that is part of this depoliticization and de-radicalization which happened. And the role of the social democratic parties also shifted in this period. The social democratic parties started off as mass organization which represented the interest of workers in the struggle. But in the period after the class compromise, they slowly turned into becoming mediators between labor capital, administrators of the class compromise. So they lost, in a way, their role as the mass organization which defended the interest of workers into becoming the mediators and administrators of the class compromise. And that is one of the most important reasons why the social democratic parties today are in a complete mess and political and ideological crisis. Because the compromise started to break down, as it did in the 1980s in Europe, that completely took away the basis for the role of the Social Democrats that they had. Let me use another figure in order to try to explain how the welfare state was developed at the national level. This figure here is the private capital in society. And what the Social Democrats did in this period was not to socialize or to democratize the private ownership of capital. What they did do was to limit the power of capital through legislation, through building a fence around private capital like this. Trade protection, this was one thing. Capital control was another thing. Fixed exchange rate, maybe it doesn't sound as important, but it is important, particularly if you've seen over the last 10 to 20 years how much speculation it has been in exchange rates in the world. Regulation of investments and of banks, on financial institutions. Labor legislation and collective agreements and all these things which regulate the security and safety and wages of workers. And last but not least, an increasing part of the economy was taken out of the market and made subject to democratic governance through a growing public sector. So this was, in a way, this was the political economy of the welfare state. This regulation had to be established in order to develop the welfare state. Some people, and from time to time in the discussions I've had, said that the welfare state will develop in all countries when they get rich enough and all these kind of things. Well, I say, if that has been the case, which country would have been a leading welfare state in the world in the post-war period then? It would have been the United States of America. But that was not the case. And why not? The working class and the labor movement in the US, they were never able to come to this level of regulation and control of the economy. So they were not able to develop the welfare state as we understand it. So this had to happen. So once again, it is about power. The welfare state is not only a sum of social institutions and public budgets, it is first and foremost the result of certain power relations in society. And not in general, but very specific historic development in a very specific situation. And another thing which I find interesting is that the welfare state was never planned. The notion didn't exist before the welfare state existed. It was a compromise of interest in a very specific historicization which nobody had planned. No trade union, no political party in the labor movement in the 1930s fought for the welfare state. What they fought for was socialism. And what they got when they did not achieve the socialism was a compromise called the welfare state. So, once again, it's important to see this welfare state as a mix of interest, as a compromise of interests. And the notion welfare state was not, I think there's some disagreement between researchers on this, but I think that most people now agree on that the first time the word welfare state was used was in 1942. It was used by a British priest, and he used this as the opposite, the welfare state as the opposite of the Nazi state, of the warfare state. Okay, that was in short the long lines in the development of the welfare state. I think this is useful in order to understand the welfare state and what it is, and it is important if we are going to develop a strategy today in how to defend what we achieved. But in the 1970s, we came to the turning point in history again. The crisis in the world economy. The crisis-free capitalism wasn't crisis-free after all. The crisis came back, and the social pact, the class compromise, started to break down because the employers, capitalists, withdrew from the compromise. It was not Labour. Labour hasn't withdrew from the compromise yet. And that is one of the problems we have. And neoliberalism triumphed all over the world. Capital control was abolished in all Western world in the 1980s. The markets were deregulated. And once again, we saw an immense shift in the balance of power, but this time in favor of capital. So if you look at this figure, which I said was a precondition for building the welfare state, this regulation of capital, this limiting of the power of capital in society, what has happened over the last 20, 30 years is the following. The fixed exchange rate system went bust in the 1970s when the US withdrew from the International Exchange Rate Corporation. Capital control disappeared in the 1980s. Regulation of investment and financial institutions and banks more or less disappeared in the 1990s. Trade protection slowly been built down through the World Trade Organization, although there's still some indirect protectionism among the rich towards the poor countries and so on. The huge public sector has turned into a reduced public sector, and labor legislation and so on has been put put under attack after attack. So that's the situation, that's the current situation. There we are today. So if my analysis is correct, this means that the welfare state have a very, very bleak future if this is going to continue like this. The effects of this offensive and the shift in the power, in the balance of power, is that we once again get increased pressure from competition in society. At all levels in society, competition is introduced and influencing the lives of people. At the workplace, but also in school, in society, and so on, competition is increasing. There are three important redistributions areas in society. And what happened during the welfare state was that wealth was redistributed from private to public, from capital to labor, and from the rich to the poor. That was a success, one of the success stories of the welfare state. In all those three areas, it has been turned upside down. Over the last 20-30 years, it has been redistributed from public to private through privatization and competitive tendering. It has been redistributed from labor to capital, since labor have got less and less of the value added, and it has been distributed from the poor to the rich. The poor has been poorer, and the rich has been so enormously much richer. That's the reason why we had this 99%, 1% campaign in the US, for example, to illustrate that enormous shift and the redistribution of wealth in society. And this, of course, this is exactly what undermines public welfare institutions. It's reducing democracy and increasing the power of the market. And then we have this ideological struggle going on in order to prepare the situation. So that the public sector has become too big. If you remember back to the 1980s, that was a sort of a slogan that we heard all over the world. And it has become too big in all countries, no matter the size of the public sector. It was not linked to the size of the public sector at all. The public sector was too big as long as it was there. And it was actually most too big where it from the outset was smallest, like it was in the US. And the US has, the ideological attacks on the public sector has been stronger in the US than in many European countries. Even if the US has a much, much smaller public sector than Europe has. So the myth of the too big public sector is just a myth, which is being used ideologically to weaken the public sector. And my statement is that the power relations in society and the political ideological hegemony, it is those who decide how much we are able to organize in common, or how much we leave to the market. So there is no limit how big the public sector can be. And if there are socialists in the room, they more or less go for 100%, isn't it so? Of course that is possible. It's a question of how we organize our societies. The reduction of the redistribution of wealth from labor to capital is very well illustrated here, both in US, in Europe, in Japan, and Germany is also taken in as, because this is developed by German economists. So the wage share is that part of the value added which goes to the worker, and the other part goes to the capital owner, the employer. So the wage share has gone consistently down since the 70s and up to today. And that is actually one of the important contributing factors that led to the financial crisis, because this enormous shift in the wealth in society, that means that workers do not longer have enough money to buy all the products which are produced in the industry and so on. And that is contributing, of course, to exactly to turn the real economy into a financial economy and this economic crisis that we have. So this tendency which employers and capitalists earn from, benefit from in the short run, turns against them in the long run. But that is the built-in contradiction which is characteristic of the capitalist economy. Another thing which is not so very often discussed with the welfare state is the development from welfare to workfare. The workfare policy was an import to Europe from the USA under Ronald Reagan, actually. It was introduced by Reagan in the US. They called it from welfare to work at that time. But the main content of this change of policy was that while we had social benefits and unemployment benefits in order to redistribute wealth in society and secure the life and the living standard of people when they were out of work, now all these benefits is increasingly turned into incentives to get them back to work. And that means that it must pay to work, as they say, which means, if we translated it into our daily language, it means that you will be punished if you do not have a job. And in this way, the unemployment is individualized. You yourself have the responsibility for not having a job. And we will punish you by reducing the benefits you get if you don't get a job. So this paradigm shift inside the welfare state is very important to notice because it changes the character of the welfare state. That is, we have had long and strong discussion on this in Norway, because this is happening also in Norway and in the Nordic countries, that this workfare policy increasingly take over from what we call the welfare policy, which is redistribution of wealth. So, out from this crisis, started in the 1970s, financial crisis that we have been through, have created a situation then in which financial capital has the hegemony in society. The neoliberal offensive from about 1980 paved the way for the hegemony of financial capital in the way it developed. And development of the European Union in Europe and its institutions reflects exactly these power relations. Most of the European Union development and the institutionalization of the European Union took place in a period in which financial capital had the hegemony in society. And of course that will be reflected in the way the institutions are constructed. And that's what we see today. And we also see that the Troika, led by somebody they called Merkozy until recently, took control to secure the dominance of financial capital by this introducing a lot of new pacts and legislation in the European Union. And it took place and it happened completely without any democratic legitimacy. Social Democrats and Socialists supported this development where they were in government. Social Democrats in power have supported all the marketization and the neoliberalization of Europe when they have been in government. They have had some tendencies, some of them, to be more critical and in opposition when they're not in government, but in government they have been quite loyal to the system. And contemporary capitalism, as we see is around us today, is in a deep systemic crisis. Right from the start of this economic crisis, because this economic crisis is not something new from the last few years, it started in the 1970s and it's got up and down. But, politicians across the board, from about 1980, has responded by deregulating markets and abolishing capital control and other regulations of capital. All of governments, whether the right-wing, centre or centre-left. A neoliberal strategy of global restructuring is going on. Somebody called it globalization, and many people use that word as if globalization is a law of nature, but it isn't. What we often call globalization is nothing but the strategy, the neoliberal strategy of the hegemonic forces among the capitalists to restructure the world. And neoliberalism, as I have already said, is institutionalized in the European Union. And increasingly, the room for maneuver, the room to establish a new compromise between labor and capital is disappearing as an alternative. There is no interest anymore among the employers and capital owners to go into any compromise. Why, as I said earlier, why do you go into a compromise with somebody you can defeat? And the aim now of the strong economic interest and capital owners and employers in Europe is not to achieve a new compromise, it is to defeat the trade union movement, actually. So we are in a new phase of the development of capitalism. And from this financial crisis, we are now fully into the so-called public debt crisis. Gigantic rescue packages saved the economic system from the financial crisis. I think that it didn't only save the banks, it actually saved the system in 2008. Because credit was completely come to a standstill. It was impossible to get a loan from a bank and so on. And the enormous wealth was taken from the public purse and put into the banks and financial institutions to keep the show going. And pretty soon after that, it was developed by the government, by politicians, by neoliberals, and by the banks and financial institutions themselves, very, very strong demands on governments, on the population in these countries, to balance the budgets. So after first the banks and financial institutions have speculated away the people's money and been rescued by the people's money, the public money, the strong demand was you have to get your economy right. You have to pay back. And pay back to the banks, of course. And that's what is going on today. The ordinary people have to pay for this through the enormous austerity policies which is going on across Europe and which is destroying the welfare state. So that's the reason why trade unions and public welfare is under so immense attacks across Europe today. And Europe and a lot of the countries, member countries of the European Union and others, are on a straight course towards a depression. Because these austerity policies is not solving the problem of the crisis. It's not creating growth, it's not creating jobs. It is leading these countries towards a depression. I have so far not met a single economist that has been able, that has at all said that the austerity policy will create growth and jobs. Everybody knows that. And that is neither the aim of it. So therefore we move from economic to social and political crisis. And these draconian austerity policies, wages in the public sector have been cut without negotiation at least 10 European Union countries. Without negotiation with the trade unions. That means to defeat the trade unions. Considerable downsizing in the public sector, massive attacks on pension and social security, forced privatization of whatever is left of public property, pushed by the Troika. In other words, there is a massacre going on the welfare state in the most crisis-ridden countries like Greece, like Ireland, like Portugal, and Spain and Italy. But there are different views on this development in Europe. What we are witnessing today, said Mario Monti, who is the Prime Minister of Italy in this current situation, what we are witnessing today is the great success of the euro. And the most concrete demonstration of that success is Greece, which is being obliged to take on the culture of stability with which it is transforming itself. So you see...
Culture of stability.
Sorry?
Culture of stability. What does it mean?
This
culture of stability.
Yeah. They are forced to try to stabilize their economy.
Culture. That's the culture.
Yeah, it's not culture.
Okay.
It's not culture. It's a culture of stability.
Okay.
It's a very strange idea these economists have. Yeah.
To make dead people and to stabilize what? Death.
Death.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's a very original view, at least.
Yeah.
It's very seldom to hear people say that openly and honestly. They can think it. A lot of people think like that, I think. But they don't say it. Monty said it. So what has happened then also to this power structure which contributed to create the welfare state? Well, one of the pillars that disappeared, and the way it develops, I think very few people cried also. That is another part of the reality. But that means that the future of the welfare state depends very much on what is happening in this struggle from organized labor and allied parties, alliances to labor. And it is even worse than this, because in addition to one of the pillars that disappeared, we have got a third pillar, but on the top, pressing it down through the financial and economic crisis. And that's what I'm afraid will end like this, a breakdown of the welfare state, if not. So what went wrong? Why did we lose the welfare state, which had the support of 70, 80, 90% of the population in Western Europe? It is not the population that had voted it away. They have lost it, unwillingly. And I think there are some few things that can explain to us why this went wrong. First thing is that the social pact was not a stable situation. A compromise between different social forces can never be stable. It can go up and down, you are stronger, you are weaker, and that will change the situation. And the compromise was a compromise in a concrete historical situation, based on whatever you say, everything from the Russian Revolution to the strength of the labor movement in Western Europe. And which could have been seen, and which was seen by great part of the trade union labor movements in the 1930s and in the 1940s and 50s as a tactical compromise, because they did, some of them did that. They said, let us go into this compromise to stabilize the situation and to mobilize for further social progress. But that was left out of the picture pretty soon. So the labor movement turned this tactical compromise more or less into the final aim. The welfare state became the aim. The compromise became the aim. And I think that was one of the mistakes that was made. And power relations remained intact. The main power, central power of a capitalist society, namely the ownership of capital, was not democratized. And that's the reason why it was so easy for them to go on the offensive and to defeat the labor movement again. And also that, what I explained more or less, the ideology of the social pact proved wrong. Because the ideology of the social pact said, we have reached a new phase in development, we have finished this crisis, we have no more unemployment, mass unemployment and all this kind of thing. We have control now of the economy, we are going to reform us into the below plan. Obviously, it has proved wrong. It wasn't like that. So, I also think that the trade union labor movement was taken by surprise in the 1980s by the neoliberal offensive. They didn't expect it. And they have still not been able to develop sufficiently good responses and alternatives to that. So my conclusion is this was, which was the precondition for establishing the welfare state, it was just not enough. We have to go further. And the key question is what do we do to this? It is not sufficient to build a fence around it. We have to democratize the core of the system. So, no new struggle for welfare state, we have to go further. But then, when we need it as much as we do today, the labor movement is in crisis. The political, ideological crisis on the left, not only the Social Democrats, but also to the left of the Social Democrat. The system criticism which we need today is more or less non-existent. Only in small group on the left can we hear that. And there are very few attempts at mobilizing for power struggle in society. There are some tendencies now with the most crisis-ridden countries, with a lot of general strikes and so on, but they are limited and short-sighted. And almost no measures have been put in place in any country in order to weaken the power of financial capital in society. If you remember back to 2007, 2008, there was a lot of proposals coming up when the financial crisis came of how are we going to get control of that? How are we going to regulate financial markets? How are we going to introduce this tax and that tax and Tobin tax and transaction tax and all these kind of things? It didn't take long before all these proposals more or less disappeared. And it's quite the opposite. What they did was to reinterpret the crisis, the causes of the crisis. Now it is no longer the financial crisis and the speculation and the capitalist economy which caused the crisis. Now it is people that have lived beyond the means, used too much money. So the crisis is reinterpreted as public irresponsibility. And if we look at the social democratic parties, which were so important in building the welfare state, and which themselves see themselves as the father and mother of the welfare state, in the current situation, they have been a driving force in the last 20, 30 years in the development of the European Union as a clear neoliberal project. They have supported all the pacts, all the treaties which have defined European Union as a neoliberal project. And they have consistently supported the single market in the form of deregulation and marketization. The social democratic parties, social democratic governments has, though, only been in majority in one short period in the history of the European Union, and that was at the end of the 1990s. But as many of themselves say today, it was the lost opportunity, because nothing changed in the European Union in the period in which Social Democrats was in majority. So no, the Social Democrats in Europe has never been as weak as today, while the political crisis is deeper than ever before. And even inside their own movement, they have started to become some of them started to be very self-critical for this. This is a way, they gave it, last year they published a book called The Future of the European Social Democracy. It was published by a social democratic institution called the Social Europe Journal. And what they wrote about, I was surprised by reading this about their own party. They said, in the last decade, European social democracy has ceased to be about either society or democracy. In government, it has embraced liberal economic principles that undermine solidarity and association. Along the way, the idea of the common good has been lost, and there is no vision of a good society. That is quite strong to say about your own party, Social Democrats. But I think they are right. So we see a new Europe racing today, with more than 10% unemployment, 15% working poor, 25% of all jobs are considered precarious, explosion in Italy where they consider 60% of the jobs to be precarious, social dumping is rapidly growing in many industries, and there's massive attacks on labor and laws and agreements. And in this situation, they have come up with all these new treaties and pacts and regulations in the European Union. I'm not going to go into them, but just to remind you of the European semester, the new economic governance, the so-called six-pack, the Euro Plus Pact, the fiscal pact, which is the last one, and a new system of economic sanctions on member states if they don't follow the rules, the stricter and stricter rules. So the austerity policy in the European Union are turned into a matter of principle. And in reality now we can say that Keynesianism is banned by law in Europe today. That means that the old traditional reformist social democratic policy is banned by law in Europe, and it has been supported by the Social Democrats. Even the very moderate European Trade Union Confederation, the previous General Secretary said when this Euro Plus Pact was published that EU is on a collision course with social Europe. This is not a pact for competitiveness. It's a perverse pact for lower living standards, more inequality, and more precarious work. That is also a pretty strong statement from a very moderate trade union, European trade union organization. Many economists like Stiglitz and Krugman and others from the US and also many in Europe, they say that the austerity policy doesn't work. They do not create growth, they do not create jobs. But my statement is that that is not the aim of the policy, as I said earlier. This policy, this austerity policy in Europe now is implemented in order to destroy the welfare state and defeat the trade unions. There is no use to have illusions about this. This is what is going on, and there is a very, very strong economic interest behind this development. So the elite uses the crisis, in other words, as an opportunity to carry out what they did not achieve with the Lisbon strategy, but now with shock therapy, as Naomi Klein has called it. And some of the consequences of this is the European Parliament is being completely sidelined, and ever more so the national parliaments. And this policy represents a dramatic further de-democratization of economic politics in the EU. The measures are pro-cyclical and thus socially and economically destructive, which means that it will lead to a deep depression. The measures satisfy financial capital growth. And together these represent the institutionalization of the hegemony of neoliberalism and finance capital in Europe. So are we then moving towards an authoritarian European Union? I think so. What is going on now is exactly that financial capital aims at privatizing what is left to privatize and to redistribute wealth in Europe from bottom to the top. To secure this redistribution, trade unions and union rights must be undermined and weakened, because it is still the situation the trade union movement in Europe is a strong potential resistance to this policy. And the crisis-ridden countries are being set under administration by the Commission, the European Central Bank and the IMF, the so-called Troika. And in short, a more authoritarian supranational state to defend private property and capital power is rising at the European level. Or is there a possibility to an alternative, a democratic solution of the current situation? If so, the crisis must be used to disarm financial capital and to regulate the markets. The public sector must be used to damp the effects of the crisis rather than the opposite as is happening today, and to stabilize the economy. But only the trade union movement and its allies have the potential to push solution in this direction. But potential is one thing, practice is something else. And it is a formidable mobilization which is necessary if this is going to happen. But it can happen, of course, with mobilization. There are other forces in society that are mobilizing in the current situation, and that is the extreme right and the right-wing populism. The capitalist crisis itself creates a real basis for alienation, exclusion, discontent and polarization in society. And the workers feel betrayed by the so-called old, or their own politicians. They feel that they are not represented any longer by the traditional Labour parties. And the extreme right support all discontent in society. That is the central characteristic of the right-wing populist party, that they support all kind of discontent, whatever it is. And they try to channel this discontent in what I call political perverted directions. Against other groups, against immigrants, against Jews, against whatever it is, if they can use that. And the only alternative to this is not to confront, particularly, of course we have to fight the right wing, but the most important way to prevent this development is to have a policy on the left which politicizes the discontent and channels this into real fights for collective solutions. And we do have a lot of important challenges ahead now. The class compromise has broken down, the social partnership ideology is doomed to fail. What we have seen over the last 20 years, 15 years at least, is negative and partly catastrophic experiences with social democratic and center-left governments in countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, in France, Italy, Norway and Denmark. And one strange thing, I think, is that it is not only so that the European Union moves in an authoritarian direction, because that is quite obvious as I see it. But the important thing is this is without being noticed by the broad left. So what should the unions do in such a situation? What are the sort of strategies? And we cannot raise too high demands, because the trade union movement is in a crisis and has to walk before it can run. Right. So one of the most important things we have to do in the current situation is to come up with alternative analysis to the mainstream very strange histories we heard about the crisis and the causes of it and so on. We have to develop a system-critical analysis of the current situation. Secondly, we have to build new, broad social alliances. The trade unions cannot do this alone. That is what I've been doing in Norway with this campaign for the welfare state, which is a broad coalition of trade unions, of peasants' organizations, of women's organization, of students' organization, and so on, in order to defend what we achieved through the welfare state. We have to develop concrete alternatives. That means that there is one of the reasons why people accept privatization of public services, that some of them are not good enough. They are bureaucratized and they do not deliver. And people get discontent with them. We have to take that seriously and not defend failed public services. But we have to come up with a policy in which democratization of the public services is a solution or alternative to privatization. We have to democratize, give people and users of the public services more influence over how they are developed. Fourth, trade unions must be more political. That is a controversial question. By political, I do not at all mean more party political. Quite the opposite. There should be less party political, but more political. In political, in the term that which I use, is that they take a broader responsibility for social development. Not only wages and working conditions and so on, but a broader responsibility. Develop solidarity across all borders, and that is not national borders, but also borders between private and public, borders between different sections of the trade union and working class and so on. And last but not least, to create democratic and action-oriented unions prepared for the confrontation which will come. And that means also to restructure and to reshape our unions, because there are too many old-fashioned bureaucratized unions with bureaucracies which are not interested in fighting. And then we have to develop gradually our visions and alternative or alternative future, because defensive struggles are important and has to be taken in order to defend what we have. But in the long run, it is also difficult to mobilize people for defensive struggles if we don't have a vision of another society in the future. And that has to be developed. And then we have to go beyond Keynesianism. Emancipatory social policies presuppose a shift in the balance of power society. The welfare state did not go far enough in taking democratic control of the economy. And a new needs-based social model will have to go beyond the Keynesian model. Do we see light at the end of the tunnel? Well, under the current conditions, we are facing the end of the era of the welfare state if nothing happens. If it continues to develop as it does today, then we say the end of the welfare state. The task now is, that is my statement, the task now is not to save the welfare state. I think the welfare state of the 1960s cannot be reproduced. But what we have to do is to defend the achievements which were won through the welfare state. I don't know if you take the difference here, because To defend the welfare state is more of, it must be based on a view in which we believe that the welfare state can be re-established and be a stable system for the future. And I don't think so. So it's much more important to defend what we achieve through the welfare state in a sort of defensive short-term perspective, and the long-term perspective is to go further. Our future will depend on the development of the social struggle and the balance of power in society. And a higher level of civilization, which notion which I've taken from Samir Amin. By this, I think Samir Amin means socialism. It is still possible, but only through mobilization of broad social forces. And the resistance is on the rise in Europe. It is not only a pessimistic picture. The ongoing social degradation is provoking social unrest in country after country. Enormous mobilizations and general strikes have taken place in the most crisis-ridden countries in Europe over the last couple of years. Last week, the 14th of November, was a historic day in the history of the labour movement in Europe, actually. It was the first time in history when there was coordinated general strikes and other actions across Europe. 6 countries had general strike on the same day. Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, and Malta. And there were enormous demonstration and mobilization in a number of countries, like France, like the UK, but also in a number of Central and Eastern European countries. So that was a very, very good sign. That is exactly what we need to learn to work together, to develop solidarity between movements across the borders in Europe, to try to avoid this contradiction which some try to develop. It is currently a defensive struggle in need of alternatives and visions of another society. I've taken the sort of opportunity to try to develop what is a minimum program of a trade union movement, the actions across Europe today. What can unify us? It has to be some generalized demands, but it has at the same time to reflect the real life of people, the real problems that people experience on the one side, but it also has to attack those elements of the existing economic system which contribute most strongly in creating the crisis. So my 5, 6 points or whatever it is first thing, of course, today is fight austerity, defend our public services. Secondly, redistribute wealth, let the rich pay. Third, cancel public debt created by the financial crisis. Fourth, socialize banks and financial institutions. Fifth, defend democracy, break the fiscal pact. And last but not least, put in an environmental climate change demand in order to, because I think it is important in the current situation with the climate crisis, climate catastrophe just in front of us, we have to start to build the alliance between the trade unions and the environmental movement. That is an important alliance in the future, and that's the reason why I put in one of the demands like that. So, that is my message. It is not the most optimistic you have heard. It is realistic, I think, but we have the fight ahead of us. Thank you.
Between, let's say, workers in West Europe and South Europe, in the way and in the sense that they will maybe act as a unique force, or you find that the current situation of fighting for your own wealth, nation or regions or what else, can lead to some clash in ideas between, let's say, trade unions in the south and trade unions in the north, because as you probably know, there were some not nice hearing words from the people from the North Europe engaged us. People in South Europe, which is normally when that very strong tension in material ways happened as it now.
Yeah, we have all heard about the lazy Greeks, haven't we?
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is, it is not the trade union movement in the North which have pursued that. It is the media, the right-wing media and the mass media. They developed that immediately, and they came up with the explanation that the Greek situation was not an effect of the financial crisis, the capitalist crisis. It was an effect of the Greek people that lived beyond their means. So that's exactly what it is. But and they mobilized, and as long as this is the dominating information that people got on the media, of course, a lot of people start to believe in it. But I think it was a very good signal as well. On the 1st of May demonstration in Germany this year, the main slogan from the trade union center and from the biggest unions in Germany was solidarity with the Greek workers. That was an attempt from them to try to hit back, to try to push back that. But we also have there are reaction on other questions as well. When the Greek workers say, get rid of the debt, cancel the debt, workers from the north say, we are not going to pay your debt, so on. And on the other hand, also people in other countries in Europe say to Germany, you benefited from this. You cut the wages and benefits from your own workers at the beginning of this century, and that's the reason why you win the competition, you benefit from this development, and so on, so on, so on. So there is a potential all the time to have a split here. And the only way to meet it is exactly the way that the German trade union movement did. They say solidarity with the Greek workers. But it is even more difficult than that, of course, because that is at the sort of ideological, political level. But what happens when the trade unions in Germany negotiate with the employers? Well, that it's a tendency to develop some kind of what we call business unionism. So they agree with the employers, with the companies, to do what is necessary to make them competitive in Europe. And that is also a problem. If trade union movements in each country, if the task for these unions become to mobilize behind their own capitalists, that is of course a problem. But I don't have any other response to this than what I said earlier. Solidarity is something which is developed through struggle. It doesn't come by itself, never. So we have to fight for it.
So nice note to end. Thank you, Asbjørn Wahl. We have to conclude, so I will just give a short announcement for tomorrow. We continue tomorrow morning at 11 with the debate of similar issues. Recently there has been European People's Initiative led by the public service trade unions to proclaim water as a human right and to secure water and sanitation to every citizen of the EU based on public service provision. So there has been a lot of talk about remunicipalizations, and this was very intense around issues of water supply. And it is with this that we'll continue our discussion tomorrow, reflecting on the strategies of trade unions. There will be local trade unionists here, Mario Vejkovic and Rakic. So if you have time, be tomorrow here at 11. And after that, we'll look at some of the strategies of privatization, public-private partnerships, marketizations that are going on in different sectors, and basically how the capital is working its way into these services. Then in the afternoon at 5 we have a debate on the future of struggle for spatial justice, which is focused more here on the region and Croatia. There has been a lot of things going on over spatial justice over the last 4 or 5 years, so be there if you want to find out what's going to happen next. And in the evening we have a lecture by an operaized or post-operaized Italian or autonomous Italian historian who will talk about crisis of capitalist relations and the need for Plan C. So thank you for coming. Once again, thank you, Asbjørn Wahl. See you tomorrow. One thing more. Outside there is a work by Pablo de Soto, who's here. Maybe he should say a couple of words about the work himself. That you can check out for tomorrow's day, and it's presented here as well today. So, Pablo, I'm sure you're good at presenting what to do.
Actually, it's just a playlist of videos of a workshop that we did in Istanbul. It's called Mapping the Commons, and it's with around 25 students, mainly of architecture, and 10 days. We looked to the metropolis and we produced like 8 videos about commons as public space, the water, cultural commons, etc. My idea in a way was to politicize the for example, the studies of architecture through this lens of the commons, and it's there in the computer.